Excellent. All right. Now you.
So, just so there's absolutely no uncertainty, I'm Peter Duinker, the retired professor. That's Peter Bush, in fact, my former student. So you might wonder why it takes two Peters to deliver this talk. Peter and I have been working together for more than 25 or so years, and we worked on old growth together. But we both love to give this talk, and we both could give the whole talk. But we figured you're getting two for the price of one, and that's got to be better than just one of us giving this talk. So I gave the talk alone 2 weeks ago in Weymouth, and I thought the title was a little bit boring, Progress in Protecting Nova Scotia's Old Forests. So I put that additional title on the top, Out with the Old and In with the New. And it wasn't until I was starting to talk that I realized that that could be so badly misinterpreted. Out with the old growth, in with the new growth. No. Out with the old policy, which you see on the left side of the screen, and in with the new policy on old growth forests. So let's, we're using two devices, although this one's not advancing. Do you need to put that one in a different mode? Oh, wait a second. It is advancing. Well, why did I smarten up and do it right?
Well, you said you were experienced.
Are you messing with that now on me? No, you're not. Okay. Because I don't like looking up there when I have to speak to the crowd. So the topics Peter and I want to cover today. We're going to start with addressing the question why old growth forest is so special. I'll address why did we need an updated old growth forest policy. We'll talk about the process to get that update done. And we'll talk about what the new policy says that's different from the 2012 policy. The current one, the new one is 2022. We'll also say something about what's in the policy for woodland owners, and that's probably what you most want to hear about. And then finish up with addressing what the next 4.5 years holds, and it'll become apparent why we're talking about 4.5 years. So the first question, why is old growth forest so special? For two reasons, I would say. We cherish them for such a diverse range of values. And I want to talk to you a little bit about those values, because we have actually studied them at Dalhousie University. And at the same time, they are so very rare in this province. We're not going to throw the data in front of you about how much old growth forest we think there still is in the province, but most people are comfortable with the notion that however we define them, there's not much left. So, why is old growth so special? We studied this about 15 or 18 years ago when I had a research project with the Bowater Mersey Paper Company, which had asked me if I would go and find some readily available research money and invest that in students to study the old growth forests on Bowater Mersey Paper Company's land, which would be about, at that time, 240,000 hectares in southwest Nova Scotia, and help the company develop a more nuanced old growth policy for its own land. It had a very blunt policy until that time, so we agreed to engage together and do that work. I was very fortunate that Peter Bush wanted to come down to Nova Scotia and help me with that project. And so together, we implemented the project and gave the Bowater Mersey Paper Company a report in February 2009. In addition to doing ecological studies on the old growth forests of that property, and doing some modeling studies to see how it would be possible to increase the amount of old growth forest across that landscape, depending on how the forests were managed. I also have 2 graduate students working with me on why people find old growth forest special. Well, first of all, do they find old growth forest special? And secondly, if they do, why? So Joanne Moyer and Rochelle Owen worked with me to try to figure this out. And we mounted a very special study where Rochelle took groups of citizens out to the woods for a day-long session. And in the morning, we visited a variety of stands, some old growth, some not. People wrote in their diaries what they were thinking about, and then we got together in the afternoon after lunch and had a focus group session and had some conversations about what people saw. Together with Joanne Moyer, who also studied old growth forests, the 3 of us published a paper about the forest values associated with old growth. And we were looking for a way to put our understanding into a framework for old growth forest values. And we did that first by looking in the literature to see who, or was there a framework for forest values out there, old growth or not. And the picture on the left is one we found in the literature from the United States. So we thought, okay, let's start with that and see where it takes us. And based on the findings from our focus groups and woodland diaries and so on, we discovered that old growth forests are not well represented in that values framework that had been published. And so we published the framework on the right-hand side, which makes it very clear that old growth forests have a very wide range of non-material values to people. People very much cherish old forests, old growth forests, and not only for the big logs or the mushrooms we might find there, for many of the non-material values. So we know for sure that old growth forests are special to the people of Nova Scotia. So why did we need an updated old growth policy? Wasn't the one from August 2012 good enough? Well, it was good, but along comes the independent review of forest practices in Nova Scotia. Professor Leahy led that. I was one of Professor Leahy's advisors. Had a great time learning even more about Nova Scotia's forests and what people thought about how they ought to be managed. And I actually helped Bill come to grips with what he might recommend about improvement in the way we deal with old growth forests in the province. And so here in summary form are the various points that were in Leahy's recommendation number 17 of the 45 or so recommendations in his report. So he spoke to the improving the abundance and conservation of old forests by implementing ecological forestry, and we do that now through the Silvicultural Guide for the Ecological Matrix. He spoke of accelerated and improved data collection so we know more about the old forests we have. He spoke to a reconsideration of the area proportion targets in the policy, and we'll speak to that with respect to the new policy. He spoke to adding old forest restoration targets, and that's kind of before we knew that there was going to be a silvicultural guide for the ecological matrix, and developing a silviculture manual for old forest restoration. Now I'm going to hand it off to my junior colleague, Peter Bush, to take it from here.
So is that the new part? Sorry. We were trying to determine who's going to have more jokes. So I'll do my best to at least one-up my mentor, Peter Duinker. So it's his fault that I'm here, right? So one, he dragged me here to help with the Bowater study, and two, he helped write the recommendations for the review of forestry practices about old growth. So thank you. So when government gets tasked with, trying to solve these problems, what do? They put together a team. So we put together a team. What do all those letters stand for? Well, PhD, I think, stands for piled higher and deeper, right? BS, I think we know what BS means. Masters of S, that makes sense. But what does Meg got there? REM, and I think she said that it's a master of really everything that matters. There's a text. So we got a lot of different folks in there. So, oops, that was to you. I changed there and I changed here. Right. So what did the team do? We just didn't stand around on a bridge and think about old growth. We consulted. So we started with staff. Well, why with staff first? Because they've been working in forests for a while and wanted to contribute. And staff come from various groups within our department. We're not just foresters, we're biologists, we're geologists, land administration, the whole range, technicians, and so on. So we started with them. We did targeted stakeholders. So we went and had conversations, and I believe this was going on in COVID. So we had hoped that, maybe they're face-to-face, but they were all phone calls, and they had to talk to Peter Square for those conversations. So it was a great way to start, get the ball rolling. We had a minister's advisory committee. We contacted other departments. This must be a government document. Lots of short forms. ECC, that's Environment and Climate Change, our sister department. We talked to them. Energy and Mines, at the time, government always reorganizes, right? They were another department at the time. We brought them over to improve our relationships there. Transportation or Public Works. We did formal Mi'kmaq consultation, and then we did public consultation. So we did the first part of the consultation. What do you think, what should be included? And then we did a draft, sent it to the public, got feedback. 128 doesn't sound like a lot maybe to you. There's probably 128 people here or close. But for public consultation, it's actually pretty good. Very thoughtful comments. I know there's some people that wrote comments either as an organization or individuals. So that was very helpful. We wrote a report saying what we heard. Okay, and we also had a jurisdictional scan that was written by Case and others at the back. So that was helpful. Did I go the right way? Yes, I did. There we go. So what's in the new policy? Well, first, it supports the overall approach to ecological forestry, where we're prioritizing biodiversity for these uncommon and unique ecosystems Peter talked about. It fits into the conservation zone. I think I heard someone say unofficial. It's official. Those conservation zones are official. The old growth in there are part of the conservation zone, and they are set aside for long term. It incorporates new science. All this research that happened at Dell and St. Mary's and other universities really helped. One of my students from UNB really helped us understand the coastal black spruce old growth. Coastal black spruce old growth? Yes, Emily found that it is old growth, which there was some debate about. So build that new science in, local expertise, traditional knowledge. That's one of the things that this policy really helped do as compared to the, quote, old policy. And clearly what we heard about from the public consultation was voluntary conservation on private land. That's something that we've been practicing in Nova Scotia for a while, and this policy continues that approach. Okay, so some key highlights. Well, there's a name change. One was called the Old Forest Policy. One is now, the new one is called the Old Growth Policy. Sounds like semantics, but there is a difference, and we saw that, we heard about confusion between all these different terms and short forms. So we're just focusing on old growth, that is the oldest stuff as defined. So the next bullet, if there's one message to take away from this, it's all old growth on Crown land is protected long-term under this policy. Pretty big statement. You do that jurisdictional review, compare what's going on in BC or any other province. This is, what's my term? Best in class, I like. Okay. For those from the 80s, I'm going to throw in Rumsfeld. Do you remember Rumsfeld? He was the Secretary of Defense for Bush. So I'm not bringing this up just because I am Bush. But he made the statement, some of you might agree, he made some odd statements. He used information theory. He was actually a bit smarter than he seemed at times, and he said there was known knowns, remember that one? And known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. Anyone remember that from the 80s? Around 4? Yes, yeah. Well, one person. There we go, we got one now. Okay, so why am I bringing this up now? So the policy protects all known old growth and all unknown old growth. So it's kind of like species at risk, right? So there is, Cindy Stacia was talking about the Canada warbler. So they are protected whether we know it, it's there, we find it on that piece of crown land, or when we do find the next one, it is also protected. So that same logic applies to old growth. What we know and those future ones that we will hope to find in the near future. All right. So we have a revised definition following ecologically based late successional forests and ages. So that uses, we saw maybe some guidance out there. There was another presentation that mentioned the FEC guide. I think it was in Dave's. I think it was Dave's presentation. Where's Dave back there? Yes. He does training in FEC. So to identify old growth forests, you really need that FEC. So we're training students and technicians across the province about FEC. It's important because that forest ecosystem classification really identifies the forest types that are in that late succession. Okay? And age. And so the age is unique for each vegetation type. So intuitively, we know certain forests, like sugar maple and yellow birch and hemlock, take longer to develop. They can grow older. So their age of when old growth develops is a little older than some of the coastal black spruce forests and other ones. So it's a more nuanced approach. Before, the last policy just used species, only these climax species. Science has moved beyond that sort of approach. Okay. We also clarified, it was an artifact of the last policy, that we really did deal with the fact that some of these stands were treated. The simplest definition of old growth is relatively undisturbed and relatively old. So we use science to define the relatively old with a systematic approach, saying these forests are a certain age for hemlock and a certain age for sugar maple. But the definition of relatively undisturbed, we need to fit that in. And so we picked 30 years and said that any forest with 30 years of recent disturbance would not be considered old growth. Disturbance being forest management. And so we, instead of saying it was a rotation of 30 years, so that we do a treatment, if you do a selection harvest, are you going to manage it into old growth? So we picked a year, so moving forward, that 1990, it's all will no longer be considered old growth. So it was just something that came up in a consultation. Maybe some of you commented about that. All right, there's that. What happened to the timer?
You got loads of time.
You got loads of time. There you go. All right. Some other highlights.
That's 20 minutes.
Got 20 minutes?
Yes.
All right. I've got some trivia questions if I can get a prize at the end. All right, good. All right, other highlights and changes. Stronger language in the policy about compensation. So we have a compensation. We borrow from the wetlands compensation. Some of you might know about that, where if a wetland is infilled, that they go and build another wetland or two. So if in a case of provincial need, like twinning of a highway, I love old growth. Twinning of a highway is probably a little more important, saves lives. Old growth maybe saves lives, but the minister can make decisions if that is the case. Of course, we're talking on Crown land. And then he and our current minister, if you met, would make the decision to add compensation. So not just replace that 1 hectare of old growth, but maybe 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 hectares. Okay? So that's the compensation mechanism. It's very unique in terms of our policy. It clarified roles for people in the department, including giving me a whole bunch of work to do, which is great. Stronger reporting and renewal language. The previous policy said nothing really about, are we going to report on it, or when's it going to be renewed, that type of thing. And lastly, stronger language in support of private land conservation. There we go. Too many words on the screen here, but there's a few. All right. So what are some things we're going to do? The first one is explore mechanisms. What do I mean by mechanisms? And so when I started this, I'm the forest science, GIS, computer mapping guy. I didn't know a lot about how do we engage private land owners. So I worked with some students at UNB, and we're working on understanding this mechanism. So mechanisms I thought, well, the only mechanism is we'll buy the land from you. That's pretty simplistic, right? There's a lot more that can happen. So I've been learning, and there's things like if you want to keep the land, where there's easements, there's donations, right of first refusal, voluntary stewardship. You want to gain dollars, well, there can be that sell. But you could sell to nature trusts or land trusts, as well as sell it to the government. If you do like working with the government, you can also exchange your land. So if your land is, a portion of your land is old growth, and you might be interested in something else, so that land exchange is possible. There's split receipts. I hadn't heard about that before. You can get a certain value from it, but the other can be considered as a taxable benefit, right? So that's advantage. And of course, there's the carbon market that you heard a little bit about. So it turns out there's a lot more mechanisms than just buying. The policy commits to working with land trusts and working with old growth conservation there. It also includes old growth as a priority criterion for what we purchase from private land. So the government has a fund of money. Each year we spend, approximately $1.5 million a year. Regional Services takes a look at it, and so the policy gives direction to add that criteria. It's just not about potential forestry value, potential wildlife value. It can be also about old growth forests. So that's good. On that, we've also, I was supposed to not say that we've also got some federal money because they were worried, well then private landowners would put up their prices. But I think it's good news, right? So we've got some federal money to also buy old growth forests as well. And that's an additional $500,000 a year. So, it's not going to buy a lot. I know $200,000, $2,000 or $3,000 a hectare. We're not going to, solve the old growth crisis with that money, but it's a move in the right direction. Okay? We need to do a better job of providing information through workshops. Hey, something like this. Better job on reporting on how much old growth may be on private lands. That's just a reporting, not saying we would never report. It says in the policy, reporting would only occur with private land owner permission. So it's not doing a GIS map and saying, hey, there's old trees on your property. I know another province got in trouble when they did that for wetlands. So this is just permission to do accounting. Sharing data, that's already started. We have a lot of data in terms of mapping tools and things like that that can help with private land conservation. And then developing some framework for the accounting. How can we see what's going on in private land? With approximately 65% of Nova Scotia's private land, it is important to understand that. Okay. How are we doing? Peter mentioned something about 4.5 years. What was he talking about? Well, the policy I said has some very specific dates and recommendations about reporting and renewal. And it says that we will renew this policy in 5 years. There was lots of debate amongst the team about that. But 5 years is better because it's a chance for actually to learn and to improve. And so over the next, and so we're a half year gone into it. That's why it's 4.5 instead of 5. August 2022. We're now in April. That's the half year. And so for the next 4.5 years, we're going to continue to look at consultation and try to improve the policy. So leading up to that, be prepared that we'll be asking for your opinion. How does it work? What have we done? What did we say we were going to do and we didn't do? That's important. Reporting protocols, monitoring, public reports by Old Growth Forest Coordinator. Hey, that's me. I guess I got some reports to write. Identifying what we've done in terms of private land commitments. Coordination with our protected areas target. So this is, as I mentioned, part of the conservation zone. But these things in government aren't working as silos. We are also working on a 20% strategy. Some of these lands that are set aside for old growth, whether on Crown land or through some of those private land mechanisms that I mentioned, like easements and things like that, will count towards our 20% target. We can't reach those 20% targets without some private land contributions and accounting for some of the things that we are doing in terms of good stewardship on our crown. And, various research and so on. All right. Still got a few more minutes. We've got 10. Lots of questions. Great. So, contact information. peter.bush@novascotia.ca is my email. Pretty straightforward. My name with a dot and novascotia.ca in there. What do we have? We've got websites. Well, they're not always the best ways to view things, but we have a couple of websites to take a look at. There's things like story maps on there. And hey, there's a video. I guess you can't really get that. But if you Google Old Growth Forest and MTRI and Peter Duinker, we developed a nice video that shows Peter talking about old growth forest in some old growth forest. So there's that. What we have on the screen there is an indicator of old growth. It's just an indicator. Doesn't mean just because you have coral lichen there, but it's an indicator. And so that's coral lichen on a nice big fir in Cape Breton. All right. I'd like to join. Oh, I got to change that. Sorry. Thank you, Peter. That's why he's here. This is our last slide.
And I'm sure you have questions, and the Old Growth Forest Coordinator for the province would be very happy to address them.